On February 22, 2026, Mexican federal forces killed Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho. The leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, one of the most powerful and feared drug empires in the world. The operation took place in Tapalpa, Jalisco, and involved the Mexican Army, Special Forces, and U.S. intelligence support. In the intense raid, El Mencho was critically wounded and died while being airlifted to Mexico City. The U.S. had placed a $15 million bounty on him for fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine trafficking, one of the largest rewards ever offered for a drug lord. El Mencho had transformed CJNG into a cartel-and network rivaling Sinaloa and operating widely across Mexico and into the U.S. After his death, violent retaliations erupted. Highways were blocked, vehicles and businesses set on fire, and unrest spread across multiple states, including Jalisco, Michoacán, and Tamaulipas, forcing schools and flights to be suspended. Despite the chaotic backlash, the Mexican government says this represents a major blow to organized crime, though authorities warn violence may continue as rivals contest control of CJNG networks.
On February 23, 2026, the Mexican military confirmed what law enforcement agencies across 3 countries had been chasing for over a decade. The most wanted man in Mexico was dead. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known to the world as El Mencho, a $15 million FBI bounty on his head, higher than any cartel leader in history, higher than Osama Bin Laden ever had. For over a decade, this man ran a criminal organization generating an estimated $20 billion annually, while remaining almost completely invisible to the most sophisticated surveillance operations on Earth. Then, in the early hours of a cold February morning, in a small mountain town most people outside of Jalisco had never heard of, it ended. Within hours of the announcement, Mexico was on fire, not figuratively. Vehicles were set ablaze on highways across Jalisco, Michoacán, and Guanajuato. Roadblocks shut down access to airports and military installations. The U.S. Embassy issued emergency alerts for American citizens. Former DEA officials went on national television and told tourists in Mexico, "Leave now." A national security alert went out before most people had finished their morning coffee. One man's death, an entire country destabilized. That is not what happens when an ordinary criminal goes down. That is what happens when someone so deeply embedded in the structure of a nation, someone who had spent 30 years building, bribing, and fighting his way to the top, finally stops breathing. This documentary is the full story. Where he came from, how he built it, how they found him, and what happens now that he's gone. If you want investigations that go beyond the headline, real context, verified facts, no filler, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Every video on this channel is built the same way this one is.
El Mencho had a $15 million FBI bounty on his head.
He was the most powerful cartel leader who has been killed.
The Mexican army says it has killed the leader of the country's most powerful drug cartel.
The most violent and fastest growing drug organizations in recent times.
Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, had a $15 million FBI bounty on his head, higher than Bin Laden ever had.
Aguililla, Michoacán, 1966. This is a municipality in the Tierra Caliente region of Mexico, hot, mountainous, remote. In 1966, it had no significant industry, no economic infrastructure worth noting, and no running water in most of its homes. It was, and in many ways still is, one of the poorest corners of one of Mexico's poorest states. This is where Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born on July 17, 1966. His father, Jesus Oseguera, was a subsistence farmer. Avocados, corn, whatever the land produced in a given season. His mother, Nemesio Cervantes, sold homemade tortillas in the local market to supplement whatever his father brought in. The family lived in a two-room adobe structure. No electricity, no running water. 7 children, with Nemesio the oldest. By age 8, he was working the fields alongside his father. Neighbors who knew the family during those years would later describe him to journalists as different from the other children. More aggressive, more focused on something, even at that age, though nobody could say exactly what. Teachers described him as sharp but impossible to manage in a classroom setting. Local police records show he was detained multiple times before his 15th birthday, mostly for fighting. One incident involved a broken bottle and another boy during an argument over a soccer match. None of this made him unique. Aguililla has historically produced a disproportionate number of individuals who ended up in organized crime. Researchers who study cartel recruitment patterns have consistently pointed to the Tierra Caliente region as one of the primary pipelines feeding criminal organizations in western Mexico. Poverty, geography, and the absence of any visible legal pathway to economic stability created conditions where the criminal economy was, for many young men, the only visible economy. At 17, Nemesio did what thousands of young men from that region did. He crossed into the United States. Immigration records show he made that crossing not once, but multiple times. He was deported back to Mexico at least 5 times between 1984 and 1990. Each time, he returned. During his years in California, he worked restaurant jobs and construction sites, primarily in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was learning English. He was learning how American cities worked. And according to DEA case files reviewed by investigators, he was also learning the drug trade, starting at the absolute bottom, moving small quantities of heroin and cocaine in the Mission District of San Francisco to support himself. In 1992, he was arrested in California on federal charges related to heroin distribution. He was sentenced to 2 years and served his time at San Quentin State Prison. Here is where his biography takes a significant turn. Prison, for Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, was not a deterrent. According to records and intelligence analyses compiled years later, his time at San Quentin exposed him to a network of cartel-connected individuals serving concurrent sentences. He spent 2 years learning, not farming, not construction, not restaurant work. He learned how large-scale drug trafficking operations were structured, how money moved across borders, how organizations were built to withstand the removal of individual members. When he was released in 1994 and deported back to Mexico, he was not the same person who had left. He did not go back to Aguililla. He did not go back to the fields. He went to Guadalajara. In Guadalajara, he made contact with the Milenio Cartel, a mid-tier criminal organization operated by the Valencia family, moving cocaine from Colombian suppliers through Mexico and into U.S. distribution networks. The Valencia brothers recognized something in him quickly. He was disciplined. He understood logistics. He had U.S. street experience and cross-border contacts that most of their existing people did not have. By the late 1990s, he had climbed to a senior lieutenant position, overseeing shipment coordination worth millions of dollars per operation. But he was already building something on the side. Intercepted communications from that period, reviewed years later by intelligence analysts, show a man who was quietly recruiting his own network, identifying his own suppliers, cultivating relationships with former military personnel, He was not planning to stay in someone else's organization forever. He was studying it, learning its weaknesses, and planning the moment he would stop being someone else's employee. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. The early 2000s were a period of violent reorganization in Mexican organized crime. The old power structures, the Guadalajara cartel, the Arellano Felix organization, the Gulf cartel in its original form, were fracturing under sustained government pressure and internal conflicts. The Milenio cartel, the organization Nemesio had built his reputation inside, was falling apart. The Valencia brothers were being arrested one by one. Their network was fragmenting. For most people inside that organization, this was a crisis. For Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, it was the opening he had been waiting for. In 2010, he officially established the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generation, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG. And from its very first operations, it was structured differently from anything that had come before it in Mexican organized crime. Most cartels at that time were built around a territory-first model. Seize a geographic corridor, tax everything that moves through it, and fight off anyone who tries to take it. That model produced constant, resource-intensive territorial conflicts. Mencho built his organization around a different philosophy: vertical integration, military-grade discipline, and the strategic use of extreme force not as a first option, but as a calculated message. His first major operation as the leader of the CJNG was a coordinated assault on La Familia Michoacana, a rival organization that had been dominant in parts of Michoacán and Jalisco. This was not a standard cartel conflict fought through random ambushes and retaliatory shootings. His men operated with coordinated communications, synchronized movements, and tactics that looked less like a street gang and more like a paramilitary unit. The reason for that was deliberate. Beginning in the mid-2000s, Mencho had been systematically recruiting former members of Mexico's special forces, soldiers who had received military training, some of it delivered through joint programs with U.S. military advisors, specifically designed to fight cartels. These men brought weapons proficiency, tactical planning capabilities, and unit discipline that transformed the CJNG into something Mexican law enforcement had never encountered from a criminal organization at that scale. By 2015, the CJNG had over 5,000 armed members. That year also produced the incident that announced to the world exactly what kind of organization Mencho had built. In May 2015, near Villa Purification in Jalisco, CJNG forces shot down a Mexican military helicopter using a rocket-propelled grenade. 8 soldiers were killed. It was the first time in modern Mexican history that a criminal organization had successfully engaged and destroyed a military aircraft in direct combat. The Mexican government's response was to classify the CJNG as the country's most dangerous criminal organization. Mencho's response was to release a video. In the video, he appeared surrounded by dozens of masked, heavily armed men. He addressed the Mexican government directly. The message was measured, precise, and deeply threatening. It was not the rant of someone operating on emotion. It communicated clearly and calmly that his organization had the capability and the willingness to engage the state as a military adversary. Within weeks of that video's release, over 50 police officers in Jalisco had resigned from active duty. But the CJNG was never just about weapons and confrontation. That is actually one of the most commonly misunderstood aspects of what Mencho built. The violence was the visible layer. Underneath, it was a sophisticated, diversified criminal enterprise that operated more like a conglomerate than a street gang. drug trafficking remained the core, primarily methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and by the mid-2010s, fentanyl, which would become the CJNG's most profitable and most devastating product. By 2020, U.S. authorities identified the CJNG as one of the primary sources of fentanyl entering American markets, a drug responsible for the majority of overdose fatalities in the United States in recent years. But the organization had expanded well beyond narcotics. Extortion networks across Jalisco and neighboring states generated hundreds of millions annually. Kidnapping operations targeting business owners and wealthy families were systematized and managed like a business unit. Illegal fuel theft, known in Mexico as huachicoleo, became an industrial operation. Intelligence reports from 2017 documented the CJNG stealing in excess of 10,000 barrels of fuel per day from Pemex pipelines, complete with their own tanker trucks, distribution networks, and retail outlets. The cartel also moved into illegal mining, human smuggling, and money laundering operations that involved former banking professionals and an estimated 40-plus shell companies spread across multiple countries. By 2020, the CJNG was operating in all 32 Mexican states and had confirmed presence across the United States, Europe, Asia, and South America. Intelligence analysts estimated annual revenue above $20 billion. The DEA officially classified El Mencho as the most dangerous criminal in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. government placed a $15 million bounty on his head. No cartel figure had ever carried a reward that high, and yet he remained invisible. No confirmed photographs had surfaced publicly in years. His location was unknown to authorities. His communication methods rotated constantly. Even senior members of his own organization operated through multiple layers of intermediaries, often without any direct contact with him. The man had built an empire worth more than some national economies, and had done it while essentially disappearing from public view entirely. Finding him was going to require something different from standard law enforcement methods. It was going to require years of work, significant resources from multiple countries, and eventually, a breach from inside his own circle. The hunt for El Mencho officially began long before anyone had a location. The DEA had been building a case file on Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes since the early 2010s. U.S. federal indictments were unsealed in 2017, charging him with conspiracy to import narcotics into the United States, among other offenses. The State Department's Narcotics Rewards Program listed him at $15 million, the maximum amount the program had ever offered for a single individual. But indictments and bounties are paperwork. Actually finding someone who had the financial resources of a mid-sized corporation, an army of armed personnel, dozens of fortified properties, and a communications infrastructure specifically designed to prevent surveillance. That was an entirely different challenge. The intelligence operation that ultimately led to Tapalpa involved at minimum 5 agencies: the DEA, the CIA, the FBI, the Mexican Military Special Forces Units, and Mexican Federal Intelligence. Coordination at that level is difficult under normal circumstances. Between the U.S. and Mexico, where historical tensions around sovereignty, extradition, and cartel-related corruption within Mexican institutions had long complicated joint operations, it was even harder. The DEA strategy relied on what investigators call link analysis, the systematic mapping of everyone connected to a target and everyone connected to those people until a pattern emerges that identifies a vulnerability. With El Mencho, the outer layers of his network were well documented. Mid-level distributors, financial intermediaries, logistics coordinators. These individuals had been prosecuted in U.S. courts for years. Each prosecution added information to the profile. The deeper intelligence came from two directions. The first was electronic surveillance. According to reporting by AP News and confirmed through court documents reviewed after the operation, investigators had successfully penetrated the communication channels used by members of El Mencho's inner circle. This was not a simple wiretap. It involved months of technical work to identify encrypted channels, develop the capability to monitor them, and do so without alerting the target or his security apparatus. The second direction was human intelligence. Someone close to El Mencho was providing information to authorities. Reports circulating in Mexican investigative journalism outlets, as well as a Reddit-sourced intelligence summary that was later picked up by mainstream outlets, suggest that a personal relationship El Mencho had maintained became the critical vulnerability. A woman with close access to his inner circle was reportedly geolocated by intelligence agencies over a period of several months, and her movements ultimately led investigators to the region where El Mencho was operating. The identity of this individual has not been officially confirmed by Mexican or U.S. authorities. What is confirmed is that by late 2025, intelligence agencies had narrowed their search to Jalisco. By early 2026, they had a specific region. By the third week of February, they had a property. Operation planning for what became a joint military action was conducted under conditions of significant secrecy. The primary concern was information leakage. El Mencho had spent years building a corruption network within Mexican security institutions, paying officials at the federal, state, and local level to alert him to any significant law enforcement activity. Multiple prior attempts to corner or capture him over the years had failed, and in several cases, it appeared he had received advance warning. This time, the operational circle was kept deliberately small. The decision was made to move at night, using specialized forces with full intelligence support, and to move with overwhelming force from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing the kind of coordinated defense that his security apparatus had been built to mount. On the night of February 22nd, moving into the early morning hours of February 23rd, Special Forces units converged on the town of Tapalpa and the property identified through months of surveillance. The operation was coordinated with U.S. intelligence agencies providing real-time support. What they found when they arrived was an active, defended position. El Mencho was present. He was not alone, and he did not surrender. The details of the confrontation itself remain partially under official review. What Mexican military authorities have confirmed is that a security engagement occurred at the property, that Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes sustained fatal injuries during the operation, and that he was pronounced dead while being transported to a medical facility. The operation was over before sunrise. The announcement came later that morning, initially through Mexican military channels, then confirmed by President Claudia Sheinbaum in a formal statement, then acknowledged by U.S. officials who noted the role of bilateral intelligence cooperation in making the operation possible. After more than a decade of indictments, surveillance, bounties, and failed attempts, the most wanted man in Mexico had been found in the highlands of Jalisco, in a small colonial mountain town known for pine forests, local cheese, and weekend tourists. The irony of that is not lost on anyone who has followed this case. The retaliation was immediate. Within hours of the Mexican government's announcement, the CJNG activated a coordinated response across multiple states. This was not spontaneous. This was planned. Organizations of that size and sophistication do not improvise contingency responses to the death of their leader. They prepare them in advance, they assign personnel to execute them, and they activate them when the trigger event occurs. In this case, the trigger was confirmation of El Mencho's death. Across Jalisco, Michoacán, and Guanajuato, vehicles were set on fire at strategic locations, not randomly scattered, but placed at highway checkpoints, near access roads leading to military installations, and at points leading to regional airports. The goal was to create controlled disruption, to demonstrate that the organization retained operational capability even without its leader, and to signal to rival organizations that the CJNG was not yet an open target. The U.S. Embassy in Mexico City issued an emergency security alert for American citizens in the affected regions. Former DEA Special Agent in Charge Derek Maltz appeared in multiple media interviews warning U.S. tourists to avoid Mexico during the period of instability. The advisory was not minor. It covered regions that include some of Mexico's most visited destinations. Local authorities in multiple Jalisco municipalities issued shelter-in-place guidance for residents. Schools in affected areas suspended operations. Supply chains in the region were disrupted as trucking companies refused to run routes through areas where the security situation was still developing. In the days following the operation, analysts and security researchers began publicly assessing what the CJNG's organizational structure looked like without El Mencho at the top. The picture that emerged was complicated. El Mencho had deliberately centralized authority within the organization in ways that made him irreplaceable in operational terms. But he had also, over the years, created multiple regional power centers, each with their own leadership, resources, and personnel. His son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, was already incarcerated in the United States on drug trafficking charges. His wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, known within the organization as a key figure in financial operations, had been arrested by Mexican authorities in 2020, though her precise legal status at the time of his death requires additional confirmation. Multiple senior lieutenants across different regional operations immediately began positioning for control. The succession conflict that analysts had long predicted was underway before the week was out. Security researchers who study cartel organizational behavior noted to outlets including the New York Post and AP News that leadership transitions within organizations like the CJNG almost always produce a period of intensified violence, not just from internal power struggles, but from rival organizations who view the transition period as an opportunity to move into formerly controlled territory. The Sinaloa Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, and several smaller regional organizations were identified by analysts as likely to test CJNG territorial control in the weeks and months following El Mencho's death. Tapalpa itself, the quiet mountain town where the operation concluded, became, briefly, the focus of international media attention. Residents described the night of the operation to journalists from The Guardian and other outlets as disorienting, surreal, and frightening. The town had no history of significant cartel activity in the public consciousness, and yet it was suddenly the location of the most significant anti-cartel operation in Mexican history. For the people who lived there, the morning of February 23rd began with gunfire in the mountains and ended with the world's cameras pointed at their cobblestone streets. Three days after El Mencho's death, the dust has not settled. The fires on the highways have been cleared. The roadblocks are down. But the consequences of what happened in Tapalpa are going to be playing out for months, and probably years to come. Here is what we know with confidence. The CJNG is not finished. Organizations of that scale, with that level of financial infrastructure, international distribution networks, and embedded regional operations, do not dissolve because the person who built them is gone. The cartel will fracture. It may fracture badly. Different factions will compete for control. That competition will be violent. But the underlying criminal enterprise, the trafficking routes, the money laundering systems, the corrupted officials still embedded in institutions across multiple states, that infrastructure does not disappear overnight. U.S. law enforcement officials have consistently noted, in the years since El Chapo's extradition and prosecution, that removing a top-tier cartel leader creates a power vacuum that's smaller, less structured, and often more unpredictable organizations rush to fill. The period following a major leadership elimination is frequently more chaotic and more dangerous for ordinary people in affected regions than the period before it. That dynamic is almost certainly going to apply here. The operation itself, how it was executed, how the intelligence was gathered, how the bilateral coordination between U.S. and Mexican agencies was structured, is already being studied as a potential model for future operations. The Mexican military's ability to execute a complex, intelligence-driven operation against a heavily fortified target without significant information leakage represents a meaningful capability development compared to prior anti-cartel efforts. The $15 million bounty will not be paid out to a single individual. That is not how the narcotics rewards program works in practice. But the intelligence that made the operation possible is understood to have involved multiple human sources over an extended period, and those individuals face their own significant security concerns in the period following the confirmation of El Mencho's death. At the broader level, his story raises questions that Mexico and the United States have been failing to answer adequately for decades. The demand for narcotics that funded the CJNG's $20 billion operation did not come from Mexico. It came primarily from U.S. consumers. The fentanyl crisis driving the majority of American overdose deaths in recent years was fueled, in significant part, by CJNG trafficking operations. The corruption that protected El Mencho for over a decade was enabled, in part, by the enormous amounts of money generated by that demand. El Mencho is gone. The conditions that made him possible are not. A kid growing up in Aguililla, Michoacán today is looking at the same geography, the same poverty, and the same absence of visible legal economic pathways that Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes looked at in 1966. That has not changed. What his story ultimately leaves behind is not just a criminal legacy or a law enforcement case study. It is a question, an uncomfortable, persistent, politically inconvenient question about what exactly is being solved and what is not. When the most wanted man in Mexico dies on a dirt road before sunrise. If this documentary gave you a clearer picture of what actually happened and why it matters, share it. Leave a comment with your thoughts on what comes next for Mexico. And subscribe if you haven't already. There are more investigations like this one coming, and you do not want to find them late.